Well, welcome and good morning. Thank you all for being here in the underbelly of the empire on a Saturday morning. We feel seen and so very honored. Before we begin, I want to thank our ED, Matt Brim, for all he did to make this phenomenal conference possible. Shout out to Matt and all our volunteers and our board and everybody who made this possible, so thank you. So without further ado, I would like to introduce all the speakers in the way we will go. So I was told to read only a sentence or two from all your bios for the purposes of time. So please read the full bios on our website. So let me just introduce first Brian Fehler. Brian Fehler is a professor of English at Texas Women's University, where he teaches graduate and undergraduate courses in rhetoric and writing and U.S. literature. Next up is I am Debarati Biswas. I'm the co-chair of the board of CLAGS, and I'm also assistant professor at New York City College of Technology, and at times I teach here at the Graduate Center. Then we have Xiangyu Deng. Xiangyu is a Chinese visual artist and researcher based in London. After completing his MA at the Royal College of Art, he's currently pursuing a PhD at the Central St. Martin's University of the Arts, London. Then we have Schofield Zhu. Schofield Zhu is an MA candidate in the Regional Studies East Asia program at Harvard University. He graduated from NYU Shanghai with a BA in sociology and a minor in gender and sexuality studies. Thank you all for being here. I'm so honored to be on this panel with all of you to talk about queer class aesthetics. So let's get it started. Brian, do you want to? Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This might not be on, but there, I think we get it together. Now let me do shift. Alt. You got it for me. I think it's Alt tab. Oh, there it is. That's it. Got it. Okay, let me get to the start. I think this will run on its own. And no particular order, so this will be fine. Okay. And when the actual beginning slide comes round, you'll be able to see the QR code. Okay, thank you all for being here. My name is Brian Fehler. I traveled from Texas Women's University in North Texas, and delighted to be here at this conference. For all the organizers who may be here, thank you so much for being excellent hosts for us all. And I'll begin. My topic is today is the queer aesthetics of a current film and TV producer and maker, and the art of Julio Torres. There's a scene in Torres's HBO series Phantasmus in which a neon squid attempts to apply for a visa. The squid is not metaphorical exactly, but it is not simply absurdist either. Well, it is not only absurdist. It arrives at a bureaucratic threshold, the kind of threshold designed to sort, to classify, and determine who belongs, the kind of threshold so common in Torres's work, where the squid fails, in the most luminous way possible, to meet the threshold's criteria. Torres might have chosen to make comedy of the squid's failure, a kind of Haberstamian queer failure, we might say, but Torres' interest, his art, lies not in that direction. The territory he chooses to explore, rather, centers on the inadequacy of the system to account for something so obviously, so stubbornly there. This paper takes that scene as an entry point into an examination of a queer rhetoric of uselessness. That's the sort of strategically communicative and aesthetic uselessness that Torres develops across his hard-to-categorize television work, including My Favorite Shapes and Phantasmus, in which characters and objects marked by economic and aesthetic uselessness become the primary sites of rhetorical invention. Torres's project, to be sure, is not simply surrealist provocation of queer comedy, though it is certainly that. It is, what's more, a sustained rhetorical practice rooted in what Sarah Ahmed calls disorientation, and what Jose Esteban Munoz theorizes as the effective sensorium of brownness. These brought together a practice that refuses the neoliberal imperative toward legibility, inclusion, and productivity without romanticizing the exclusion it inhabits. Torres, a native of El Salvador, came initially to New York to attend the New School. He later joined the writing staff of SNL before producing for HBO 2 series, Los Spookies and Phantasmus. Those are scripted shows, both of which won Peabody Awards. He has since produced other works for HBO, more sort of materialist stand-up performances, My Favorite Shapes, and most recently, just last month, Color Theory. All those works reveal Torres's fascination with surrealism, absurdism, objectification, a perspective much loved by fans whom he affectionately calls, on Instagram and in interviews, his, quote, little consumers. I'll briefly analyze 3 elements of Torres's work. Very briefly, I promise. First, I turn to Ahmed's queer phenomenology to situate Torres's aesthetics in a staging of disorientation, arrivals at those thresholds of bureaucracy in front of institutions and value systems that cannot process what precisely is showing up before them. Second, I'll bring in Munoz's The Sense of Brown to bear on the racialized effect of Torres's objects and characters, in that the too muchness of his aesthetic is not merely queer, but specifically brown in that Munozian sense. Third, and finally, I'll super briefly consider a productive and provocative tension. Munoz's theorization of queer futurity in Cruising Utopia sits perhaps uneasily alongside Torres's deeply presentist sensibility. And that unease presents us with a site that is theoretically useful, one that does not present a problem to be resolved. This is just scrolling through. That's not bothering anyone, is it? Just going through? Okay. I did set timers, but ineffectively. Part 2, Arriving Wrong. Sarah Ahmed's queer phenomenology asks what it means to be oriented, that is, to find oneself facing in the direction that one's social world has not prepared one for, toward the objects, institutions, and horizons that promise a livable life, perhaps just out of reach. Orientation for her, of course, is never neutral. It is always already shaped by the lines that race, class, gender, sexuality have laid down. In advance, to be queer in her account is in part to find oneself always already disoriented, arriving at those lines from a different angle, a wrong angle, or failing to arrive at all, perhaps arriving and finding that the space does not, after all, welcome you. Torres's work is saturated with this structure of disorientation. His characters, including his own Julio, that's his name, but also his character, perpetually arrive at thresholds, visa offices, corporate boardrooms, medical clinics, social situations that have not been built to receive them. In Phantasmus's first episode, for example, the letter Q of the alphabet is a musician, kicked out of clubs, kicked out of performance spaces because Q inhabits the normal space of the mainstream alphabet, such as P and R, instead of the weird neighborhood of X, Y, and Z. Q the musician, Q the letter, and Torres's formulation do not belong where they live. Such arrivals, such as Q's in Torres's work, always present something unclassifiable, built by a system that does only that, classifies, but does so only with those narrow parameters. In queer phenomenology, Ahmed also discusses those straightening devices, quote, those mechanisms by which normative space attempts to, quote, correct, unquote, or eliminate what does not fit. The most consistent straightening device in Phantasmus is a document called the Proof of Existence, which Julio needs in order to rent a new apartment or to do really just about anything. That proof of existence document, in fact, is needed for any official activity, and its pernicious ubiquity in all facets of the late capitalist world that empowers it continually frustrates Julio, the character. The proof of existence requirements certainly are parallel to and critiques of increasing impositions of documentation requirements of voter suppression and quote-unquote undocumented people. In the show, though, Julio pursues not the proof of existence path itself, but instead, as you see in one of these slides, a lost golden oyster earring, the magical talisman that he thinks once he possesses will also prove his existence. We might think of Ahmed especially adding here the insistence that disorientation is embodied and spatial before it is mainly discursive. That is, Torres's characters often usually make perfectly legible arguments, really. Their arguments, though, are too big, perhaps too extraneous, too much in and for such spaces. They fail always to fit. And that failure is registered sensorially in the absurdist comedy of wrong-shaped bodies in wrong-shaped spaces, in the effective charge of being deemed always too much, too useless, too strange. His sets, I might add, thus matter in a way of matter that is purely not textual, and that textual analysis only would miss. Okay, the third part, too much. If Ahmed gives us the spatial and phenomenological grammar of Torres's project, Munoz gives us its effective texture and perhaps a racial specificity that is even a better route for exploration. In the sense of Brown, Munoz develops brownness as a sensorium, that is a way of feeling through and being felt by a world that has organized its value structures around one's explicit exclusion. Brownness there is the effective remainder of that exclusion, the excess that doesn't fit, the sensation of being simultaneously hyper-visible and yet illegible, the attachment to objects and pleasures and modes of being that the dominant culture has marked as worthless. Torres's aesthetic is Brown in precisely that sense. The objects he loves, such as the star character, who is my favorite shape show, the little toy-like Pirulin Pinpina, whom you'll see sometime, or the robot Bibo, they carry specific affective charge that Munoz helps us name. The charge of objects that have been marked as too much by a value system organized against them. Munoz's brownness is also explicitly racialized in ways that a purely class-based or queer account of Torres's project might potentially, at least partially, overlook. Torres is a Salvadoran American working in a predominantly white cultural industry, and his surrealism is not culturally neutral. Besides the proof of existence's parallel with show me your papers laws, for example, in color theory, Torres recounts an experience of attempting to fly when his visa documents are questioned. And in color theory, perhaps tellingly, brown is not a color explored, though the baggy pants he wears are brown, and the t-shirt bright white, perhaps representing the contact zone of the skin he's born with and the whiteness he might have been expected to don in those bureaucratic thresholds in order to, as it were, unproblematically fly. And this is the conclusion. There's a version of this argument, I suppose, that would end by claiming Torres as a kind of utopian, a Munozian figure of queer futurity, pointing toward the not yet here of a world organized differently. Cruising Utopia offers resources for that reading, to be sure. Munoz's arguments there that queerness is essentially futorial, that it refuses the here and now as a side of possibility, resonates with Torres's refusal of neoliberal inclusion and his insistence on imagining otherwise. We might, though, I think, go to a different place in that resolution, because Torres's temporal sensibility is more complicated and, ultimately, more interesting. His characters are not oriented toward future, not really. They are thoroughly, even luxuriously, embedded in the present tense of their own uselessness. The melancholy in his work isn't really deferred. Rather, it can be seen and felt right there on the surface, in the present, on the screen, inhabiting the same frame as the comedy, the same neon light as the absurdist joy. His project feels less, perhaps, like anticipation than a presentist dwelling in a sustained, asceticized inhabitation of the conditions of exclusion that refuse both despair and the false promise of imminent transformation. That's all from me. Thank you all.
Can you hear me? Yep. Let me. All right. Thank you all. And what I'm going to present today, it's part of a much longer work. So these are fragments stitched together, and you will, it's a kind of aesthetics of unlikely coalitions, may I say. So it's, I'm trying to make sense of these fragments, so that's what I'm going to present today. So, yesterday, at that great panel on Amber Hollibaugh, some of you invoked Amber Hollibaugh, but also talked about Sherry Moraga. And so I'm going to start with Sherry Moraga and, her famous provocation, a powerful provocation from this bridge called My Back, 1981 preface. And, it's a long quote, I'm sorry, but it's full of quotes. And I'm bringing this up in order to think about this idea that all class issues are queer issues. And, I would say that Sherry Moraga summons us to think about the material grounds of subject formation, which are not static. I'm sorry, I forgot to set my own timer. Let me first do that. Okay, so Moraga summons us to think about the material grounds of subject formation, which are not fixed or static, but relational. Moraga draws our attention to difference, not for the purposes of arguing for a politics of identity that often erase the differentials of power, value, and belonging within and among groups, but to highlight how the colonial racial capitalist logic transforms difference into deviance. Julie's hypervisibility within a white suburb versus Moraga's own invisibility on the subway and in Harvard Square. The black boy on the train, and this is the next part of the quote. The black boy on the train, marked by the colonial racial capitalist power structure as deviant and therefore disciplined, and the quotidian fact of state-sanctioned killing of yet another racialized subject. So Grace Hong and Roderick Ferguson astutely point out that, quote, the mobilization of difference by women of color feminism and queer of color critique was intended to erase the differentials of power, value, and social depth within and among groups as in a multiculturalist model, but to highlight, not in a kind of multiculturalist model, but to highlight such differentials and to attempt to do the vexed work of forging a coalitional politics through these differences. And so, this last part of this quote is so very important. What does this mean about the boy shot in the head is what I want to know. I'm a lesbian. I want a movement that helps me make sense of the trip from Watertown to Roxbury, from white to black. I love women the entire way, beyond a doubt. So herein lies the importance of attending to the queer class relations, I would argue. It is to forge solidarities and, to borrow Angela Davis's famous phrase, unprecedented and unlikely coalitions, in the hopes of building bearable worlds. Moraga's preface also points to something that we often don't think of when thinking of queer class relations, the power differentials that come into play as bodies move through spaces. Some bodies move with ease, while others are pathologized under the disciplining gaze of the racializing norm or marked for removal. So my paper, Unsettled Lives and Unlikely Coalitions in Black Photography and Short Fiction, is a work in progress, as I said. This is all kind of unlikely coalitions that I've stitched together. That's the aesthetics of my own talk. So I explore representations of Black migrant life in Haitian American author Edwige Danticat's short story, Without Inspection, published in 2018, and in Black gay photographer, painter, and activist Kristen Walker's art photography, in order to understand how one needs the unbearable trauma of dispossession and displacement into moments of both Black love and belonging with each other and across race and class differences, and also a practice of refusal of the racial, gendered, capitalist modus operandi, which is competitive individualism and extractive modes of relationality within this unbearable now. So in Without Inspection, Danticat offers us a vignette of radical solidarity forged in a place structured by unfreedom. On a beach in Miami, where Black migrants managed to swim ashore after surviving the perilous ocean and ocean that lies between Haiti and the U.S. And so these shores don't have barbed wires, but ICE agents and security dogs stay ready to capture and lock them away in detention prisons. In Dantica's description, a description of the harsh realities of these sea migrations, we hear the continuation of the horrors of the Middle Passage that had once transformed Black and other racialized bodies into commodities. Arnold, that's the protagonist, had learned while at sea that time can stretch endlessly and that wind and air can suck you dry, forcing you to see what is not there. They had run out of clean water halfway through the trip from Port-de-Paix on the northern coast of Haiti and had to drink seawater or their own urine. Without Inspection begins in medias res, somewhere between life and death, as Arnold, an undocumented Haitian construction worker, because of a faulty safety harness, slips and falls from a 48-story hotel that he was hired to build. The fatal fall into the cement mixer below takes only 6.5 seconds, but Danticat refuses to sensationalize the horror of the fall. Unlike the media reporters who broadcast it while Arnold's life fades into oblivion under the bright lights of their cameras. Danticat refuses to simply tell a linear story of a construction worker with fake ID papers who gets churned and mixed into the very cement that is being used to build a luxury hotel, which he can never afford to stay in. Instead, she invites us to bear witness to the expansive possibilities of love and desire that Arnold experiences despite the unbearable realities of his life as an orphan and an indentured servant in Haiti and as an undocumented black man in Miami. So the story follows Arnold as his being takes flight from his body and reaches out to his beloved Darlene and her son Paris, cherishes the splendor of falling in love and finding home with those who have been made wretched by colonial racial capitalism, and at times relives the traumatic memories of survival. Arnold can never have access to the perks of being a citizen in Haiti or the privilege of being an immigrant with papers in the US because he is black, poor, and hails from the first free black nation, Haiti, a nation that the US has underdeveloped through a century of colonial occupation, imperial control, and resource extraction. Relegated to a perpetual state of estrangement, Arnold develops a different sensibility, one that cherishes the possibilities of loving others and recognizing another person's pain instead of an exceptionalization of his own trauma and a subsequent justification of ownership of things and property, which is the so-called American promise of happiness. And so Arnold learns to refuse propertied lives and also speak from that positionality. That is very important because not necessarily everybody speaks from that position. So Danticat offers a literary home to the lives of Arnold who are made unbearable by the logic of nation states and borders. We as readers experience the expansive possibilities of an abolitionist geography, a place where Arnold's life matters and where Black life and love thrive and grow. So within the carceral geography of Miami, quote, his dying offered him a kind of freedom he had never had before. Whatever he thought about, he could see in front of him. Whatever he wanted, he could have accept what he wanted most of all, which was not to die, end quote. As Arnold falls into the drum of the cement mixer, he tries to beat the motion of the drum by swimming and even, quote, tried to flutter kick, just as he had when the speedboat stopped in the middle of the ocean and he was told to swim ashore, end quote. Only this time, he isn't so lucky. The cement, soon to be transformed into the land beneath the feet of the privileged, stops his motion completely, unlike water. Death offers an escape from the prison of unbearable life, allowing him to finally take flight. His spirit soars above and savors one last sight of Darlene and Paris before being pulled back into the churning of the urban vortex of cement and neglect. Arnold is plucked out prematurely from life to make way for the privileged US citizens and others such citizens of the world, much like the weeds and flowers that are plucked out to make way for expensive hotels and luxury buildings masquerading as development. The ocean and the ground often claim, quote, Black bodies in motion. That is what Danticat writes. Death becomes the only available ticket to freedom. Much like Arnold, Black ancestors who perished in the ocean during the Middle Passage haunt us and remind us of this traumatic history and urge us to reimagine community, love, belonging, and this world differently. So because I'm running out of, I don't have much time, I want to move to the next part of my talk about Black gay photographer, writer, and activist Christian Walker's art photography. Christian Walker captures the poignancy and profundity of lives framed by perpetual unsettlement. So this is Christian Walker, and I first saw his work at Leslie Lohman, thanks to the wonderful curators, Noam Parnars and David O. So Walker, despite his brilliant work and fame during his lifetime, Walker remains woefully understudied and underappreciated. He was born in 1953 in Springfield, Massachusetts, and moved to Boston in 1974, where he began taking photographs and contributing words and images to publications such as Fag Rag and Gay Community News. Walker attended the School of the Museum of Fine Arts at Tufts University from 80 to 84, and after graduating, he moved to Atlanta, where he continued his photography practice. And so art critic Andrew Alexander writes that in Atlanta, quote, "In Atlanta, Walker's artistic practice shifted toward alternative photographic processes involving multiple exposures, archival appropriation, and the integration of paint and non-traditional materials." Walker moved to Seattle in the late 1990s, where he seemingly found himself in dire straits. And little is known about his life and work during this time. He died in Seattle in a halfway house in 2003 at the age of 50. So I wanted to, think about, these are some of his photographs, different projects that he did. This is from the theater project. Again, I feel like these are also bodies in waiting, but also there is a certain kind of intimacy with which Walker, captures these moments. And so I wanted to end by talking about this photograph in particular. This is from his series Performance Counts. This is one of, and so in which Walker radically and this is the photograph, the way I see it is that Walker radically restructures racialized subjectivities and how they are captured on screen. So Walker captures a moment of cross-racial intimacy or friendship between two people whose attires are more fit for lounges and bedrooms rather than a brightly lit park bench, rooms that racialized subjects often cannot own. Surplused and perhaps priced out of house lives, they embrace intimacies. Oh my God. I don't know why this is not, okay. Okay, so I'll end here. Surplused and perhaps priced out of house lives, they embrace intimacies and friendship forged on park benches, city streets, and halfway houses. Here we see echoes of Jacob Lawrence's portrayal of Black bodies in motion that Dantica reflects on, suspended between the home they were forced to leave behind and the home they seek. But Walker's representation of racialized and pauperized subjects refuses our pity and gaze and directs us to see beyond what the heteronormative behooves us to see and tell. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. My name is Xiangyu. I'm a PhD candidate at St. James Martin's University of the Arts, London. And in the next couple minutes, I will introduce my PhD project. It's a practice-based research project in queer photography, self-portraiture. So my project actually begins with tension around queer visibility. an indominant history of the Western queer self-portraiture, political agency is often linked to being seen, to showing oneself, claiming recognizable presence, and making queer life publicly legible. And that history has been very important, especially in relation to the activism, mourning, and collective affirmation. But in the context of contemporary China, visibility does not necessarily secure the recognition of freedom. And sometimes it can also bring misreading, exposure, family pressure, and social risk. So this tension is very personal as well. Growing up as queer in China, I experienced failure through the inability to meet familial and social expectations. Later in the UK, as a queer photographer, I encountered a different kind of pressure. So once from the expectation that queer art should appear recognizably queer through the familiar visual codes such as transgression, bodily display, or resistant self-exposure. And across these two contexts, I kept returning to the same question. So what happens when one fails the available scrapes of queer visibility? And this became very important in my own practice when I began to doubt whether I was making images from my own situated experience or whether I was unconsciously repeating an institutional preference for legible queer imagery. And that doubt pushed me to ask whether queer self-portraiture might be approached differently, especially from a Chinese context in which visibility is often negotiated rather than celebrated. And my project therefore asked the following three questions. Firstly, Western queer self-portraiture often links political agency to becoming visible. How does failure unsettle this visibility model and provoke alternative approaches in the context of contemporary China? And in collaborative self-portraiture workshops with Chinese queer participants, how does failure as a method articulate the image production and the accompanying decision-making and documentation practices? And finally, how a workshop encounters oriented toward queer moments and how are these moments shared and translated into forms of queer solidarity across image making and reflection. And I want to briefly position this project in relation to existing scholarships and artists. So in Western queer photography history, especially from the 1980s and 1990s onward, portraiture and self-portraiture often played an important role in making queer life visible, especially during the AIDS crisis. And this remains a vital history, but it also contributed to a very strong association between the political intelligibility and recognizable appearance. Later theorists have complicated this by asking whether visibility can itself become a norm and whether queerness must remain open, unstable, and historically contingent rather than fixed through identity codes. And my project builds on this critical opening but shifts the question to a different geopolitical setting. In China, the relationship between the queer visual culture and the visibility has followed a different trajectory. In the 1990s and early 2000s, artists working with the body, gender ambiguity, and private life found certain openings within the broader cultural transformations of the post-socialist period. Figures such as Ma Liuming challenged the stable gender appearance through the performance and bodily presentation. And in the 2000s and early 2010s, queer-themed art and exhibition culture became more visible in some urban context, and exhibitions such as Sacred Love suggested a degree of cultural openness during that moment. However, this visibility was always uneven and fragile. It depended on the local conditions, semi-private networks, or shifting institutional tolerance. By the late 2010s, public space for queer expression had narrowed significantly, and censorship intensified, public programming became more constrained, and visibility itself became harder to sustain safely. And in this context, queer art often cannot rely on the straightforward declaration or stable self-display, and it more often survives through the negotiation, indirection, ambiguity, and partial revelation. This is why I argue that in the Chinese context, queer self-portraiture cannot always be understood as stable identity claim. It may instead function as a managed relation to visibility, shaped by the family expectation, uneven publics, class position, and the risks of exposure. Here, class is very crucial. I will not treat class as a separate topic added to the queerness. It is built into the demand to remain respectable, employable, marriageable, and upwardly mobile. It shapes how much risk a person can take, how much opacity they need, and how much room they have to recover from the visibility. This is also where failure becomes important. Jack Hampton's writing on the failure remains a useful starting point because it challenges the normative ideals of success. But in my project, failure takes on a different texture in the Chinese context. It is tied not only to sexuality, but also to the kinship obligation, family aspiration, and nationwide developmental narrative. And for many queer people in China, failure is lived through the inability or refusal to occupy the role of the successful child or the respectable future that has been imagined for them. And methodologically, this is where my project makes its main contribution. So my project is built around what I call collaborative photography encounter workshops. And in these workshops, I invited the queer participants from China to join and create their own self-portraiture with my facilitation and assistance. And these workshops are structured research encounters in which photography becomes a medium through that participants and researchers negotiate the visibility, opacity of authorship, and risk together. So practice of research is very important here because the act of making, discussing, adjusting, withholding, and even reviewing the images become the part of the research process itself. And what matters is not only what the final image looks like, but how it comes into the being. I also introduced two significant concepts here to translate the failure to the embodied and practical strategies in my encounter workshops. Firstly, queer moments introduced by Sarah Ahmed provide the logic for the dialogical inquiry. So queer moments could illustrate and embody how failure appears in lived experience as a disorientation from the normative scripts. And the dialogue serves as a practical tool to articulate and reenact these things. And secondly, photography action introduced by Simon Baker and Fiona Moran justify the collaborative self-portrait experiments. This concept names a way of making images that foregrounds the process, improvisation, and performativity. And in practice, this means the photo shoot is treated as a site of negotiation and collaborative decision-making through the photography actions and in technical choices such as blur, framing, or shutter control, timing, even composition are counted at and function as responses and reflections to the queer moments articulated in the dialogic phase. Alongside the workshop, I use autoethnographic journal to document affective shifts, the decisions, hesitations, and constraints across each encounter. And it helps me track how the research develops through the moments that do not easily resolve into a clear image or clear statement. It also allows me to reflect on my own position within the encounter. This is very important to me because autoethnography in this project is a way of thinking critically about who gets to narrate, interpret, and frame queer Chinese experience, especially across the Chinese and Western academic context. And I apologize because this is an ongoing and publicly presented project. I'm not sharing any detailed field material today, but hopefully this project will culminate in both a writing thesis and an exhibition, including the photography works, the workshop traces, and the textual materials. And it will demonstrate how queer self-portraiture might make perceptible forms of opacity, negotiation, and collective agency do not depend on stable recognizability. So thank you very much for listening to our presentation, and I look forward to your questions and feedback later. And here are some bibliographies for your reference. Thank you very much. For me, I think it's quite interesting because when I heard about Brian's speech about uselessness, I think about failure as well. I think uselessness, actually, like in China, it's quite like trendy to become useless, that people are talking about, there's a word called 躺平, it's called lying down. Lying down means you just refuse to any like futurism. It's like we believe there's no future in today's political climate. And so in terms that many participants come to me, to my workshop, and they're actually trying to give a sense that they don't have to follow a kind of like normative scripts. They could live in a marginalized place, and they could still enjoy their life. And there's another alternative, like queer living and being. So, and technically, and the uselessness is also applied in my project as well, because sometimes there are not a lot of like mistakes or unexpected like technical errors, like faults, during the workshop, because sometimes the participants are not from like the art background. They're just very interested in this medium, so they come to me, and when we collaboratively, make this self-portrait. Sometimes they don't know how to, control the exposure, shutter speeds, and, the failure is everywhere. So yeah, I think that's a really important part of my project as well. Yeah.
I mean, what's interesting to me about pseudonym and aesthetics is, how I think most of us talked about this. Like I was talking about the portrayal of somebody without papers, and when he dies, Arnold in Edwige Danticat's work. For the media, for the outside world, nobody knows who he is. He's actually Cuban because that was the identity he had taken on. And so I think the aesthetics of it is to capture that which cannot be in this colonial racial imaginary. It's the too muchness that you're talking about in terms of sense of brown and a way to kind of make something present that remains unseen or invisible, right? Invisibilized, minoritized. But here in these works, they seem to acquire their own lives. And, that's kind of what I feel is very much there in, all the things we're trying to get at. I don't know, what do you all think?
I mean, something I was struck by all of our presentations was we, in one way or another, are gesturing towards Munoz's idea of cruising utopia and queer futurity. And I think as queer scholars, every one of us has our own version of Munoz. But I'm really struck by, I think, across our presentations was the idea which Munoz insists on of a utopia that is at the same time melancholic, that is at the same time a rejection of the here and now. And I think that doubleness of negativity and reparative sensibility is very much at play throughout Munoz's book, but sometimes his work is read as a simply optimistic and utopian imagination of queer utopia. But I think all of us are trying to bring that sense of negativity. As Brian, in your presentation, I was very struck by how you say the comedy, right, the comedic effect gestures towards a future, not toward future, but the melancholy of the here and now. And I think that is something I think how Munoz's work is sometimes misread, and how the kind of negativity, negative affect is actually part and parcel of an imagination of future. So I wonder if we can all speak about that in terms of how we treat this idea of reparation and futurity in the objects that we study.
I think that's right, and I think these ideas emerged early on in this conference, right? I'm thinking of Professor Rundekar and Bailey's keynotes yesterday morning about legibility and presentistness in the documentation in Mauritius or in the present tenseness in the truck stop, right? Who has the power of legibility and when is it safe to withdraw that power, and when is it safe to promote that power? I think of the work on silence, right, as well, and recent works in queer silent. Logan Smilges, I'm thinking of, who wants us to recognize that the old idea of silence equals death is still valid, right? But silence is also a powerful place in which to enact art until one's own moment of choosing, of making it public. So I think we have, each of us in our papers, this idea of the stage that is not available to art, and the ways and why and when of finding your own place there. The theme really throughout the whole conference, I've noticed.
I don't know, something that I keep thinking about, like what I presented on Danticut is, it's not LGBTQ studies, but I was talking about queerness in the way of who is the target of racializing projects. And for me, racialization folds in these relations, right? And they're always dynamic, they're moving, and that's why I'm talking about movement through these spaces and how we move. And especially now, in this kind of ruinous now, I feel like, movement and how we are thinking of space, like, Moraga's kind of provocation is, what is this queer movement? Like, what do we think when we think about queerness? Is an important thing to sit with, because, therein lies the possibility of solidarity, the possibility of, it can also foreclose solidarities. I think some of what you were saying, Schofield. So, yeah, I don't know, any thoughts on that? Anybody?
Of homosexuality.
Mentioned earlier about queer utopians, because like queerness is something, it's not yet, it's a horizon, it's something like we need to keep working on that. And I think regarding the queer movements, I think there are really complexities and nuances in inner China, and we shouldn't only focus on people who have certain visibilities, for example, people living in the big cities, and people who are in the middle class, and a lot of variations and differences in different groups of the Chinese queer, and most of their life are very invisible, but once they become visible, there are a lot of risk, pushing them. A lot of societal and familial forces got to them. So I think, regarding the queer movements, I really don't think that the Chinese queer studies should become the other in the Western institutions. So that is something that we really want to do. Is we really want to find some indigenous knowledge really happening in China. Yeah.
I'm deeply grounded in Black queer studies, and many of these questions were often taken up and talked about, even before the 90s, and of course, the third world feminism and women of color feminism, and somehow they're not heard, and those they somehow keep talking in lower frequencies for this world, but they're there, and I feel like what they were talking about is really the idea of commons. And so, what does small c communism look like? Then then the party communism. So it's really that small c communism, how do we become small c comrades of each other. And so with that, I think we will end the orientation towards becoming accomplices and small c comrades and not just allies is what I would say queer class relations and the aesthetics and the language for me is. Thank you. Thank you all for being here.